has been forgotten. Today, he basks in history's glow, a moral giant. And nothing contributes more to his stature than his decision to free the slaves. But even this story is more complicated than we've been taught.
Well, the traditional, one might even say legendary narrative about Lincoln and emancipation is that Abraham Lincoln one day freed the slaves, and that all across the South, slaves were gathered together and told about this proclamation, and from that day forward, they were free, which is, of course, nonsense.
From the moment he took office, Lincoln was pressured from every side to act on the issue of slavery, most notably by the former slave turned abolitionist and editor, the great Frederick Douglass.
Douglass was a ferocious critic of Abraham Lincoln's, calling him everything from a slave hound to the most powerful slave catcher in the United States and so forth. Douglass was an essentially radical abolitionist. He hated compromising with slavery. He was impatient with the political process about slavery. And one of the reasons that Frederick Douglass became such an intense critic of Lincoln's in the first year of the war is because suddenly here was this opportunity. Here was this chance to end it, end the cause of the war, and win the war by destroying slavery. And what happens? But the Lincoln administration returns fugitive slaves, does not want to make war on slavery.
Instead, Lincoln proposed a compromise that he believed might appeal to Southerners and Northerners alike. Pay off slave owners and ask the freed slaves to leave the country for new colonies in Panama or in Liberia. On August 14, 1862, Lincoln invited 5 prominent black men to the White House, hoping to enlist their help for his plan.
One way of interpreting that famous, infamous meeting is that this was Lincoln using a moment to appeal to public opinion, assuaging the fears of white racists out there. I don't buy that. He had for too long believed in colonization, worked for colonization. He's still arguing it in 1862. Well, in the end, this war would not allow, history, you could say, would not allow a cushioned overthrow of slavery. It was going to have to be bludgeoned out of existence.
What changed Lincoln's mind about slavery was the war itself. It was the summer of 1862, and the war was going badly. The Confederate Army had defeated superior Northern forces or fought them to a standstill. Lincoln knew he needed what we might today call a game changer, a bold stroke to alter the course of the war. Abolishing slavery would strike at the heart of the Southern economy and cripple its forces.
Slavery was the biggest resource the South has. So the largest financial asset in the United States.
So it is not, he doesn't say, let my people go. He says, that is the heart of their economy. And that is the only way we can win.
No, I'm not saying that. The first thing out of his mind and his mouth might indeed be the basic fact. I can't win this war without destroying slavery. That doesn't mean he wouldn't also go on and say, you know, we're doing the right thing.
David Blight and I toured the Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C. It was here, at his summer cottage, that Lincoln worked on his famous Emancipation Proclamation.
That language of military necessity. Lincoln spent endless, sleepless nights.
Military and Naval Authority.
He weighed over and over and over the form it would take, how to do it, the timing of it. I mean, he genuinely feared, as did members of his cabinet who cautioned him not to do it, that if he issued an executive order freeing the slaves and transformed the purpose of the war, transformed the meaning of the war, the fear, of course, was that thousands of white Union soldiers might just throw down their arms and go home.
Casting aside his fears, Lincoln decided to issue an executive order to end slavery. On January 1st, 1863, in cities and towns all across the North, there was a great sense of anticipation. Lincoln signed the final proclamation with a steady hand. "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right," he said, "than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it."
That's a man who's grown. Now, history made him grow. History dragged him in some ways to do what he did. But he did it.
When word finally came that Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, there was wild celebration. Many people shed tears of joy for a day they thought would never arrive. But few who rejoiced that day fully understood the delicate political calculus in which Lincoln had engaged. To keep the border states from leaving the Union and to remain within the president's authority under the Constitution, Lincoln had limited the proclamation to the rebellious Confederate states.
Why did not Abraham Lincoln free the slaves over which he did have jurisdiction? And he could have freed them with the stroke of the pen.
He is doing all that he has the constitutional power to do. That is, he doesn't have the constitutional power to take the property of law-abiding Americans.
That's right.
He has the constitutional power to take the property of those Americans who are not law-abiding.
And how do you decide which person harbors loyalist sympathies within a rebellious territory? He's on very dangerous ground. He knows that.
He is.
Unenforceable ground as the
Totally
first,
unenforceable. I think Lincoln believes from the very beginning that the Emancipation Proclamation will not stand in court.
Exactly.
It's the court
That's why it's
system.
such a legal document.
And the fact
it's a legal
is,
brief.
no matter what we 21st century historians say about Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, it is true, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. However, even though it didn't, you could have told my great-grandmother all this stuff about what the Emancipation Proclamation did and didn't do till you were blue in the face, but she would have always said to you, but he was the great emancipator. Most black
African Americans gave their own meanings to the Emancipation Proclamation. As Frederick Douglass famously said on the night of emancipation, it was not logic we were looking for. It was the trump of Jubilee. It was the poetry that they were looking for. I think what's happened is that African Americans have brought Lincoln to their cause. They've appropriated Lincoln. They needed Lincoln.
So much did African Americans need to believe in Lincoln as the great emancipator that in the decade following Lincoln's death, they built the first statue exalting him in that role. This is the Freedmen's Monument in Southeast Washington, D.C. It's called the Freedmen's Monument because it was financed with the meager donations of former slaves. Today, however, it elicits strong opinions among many black people who pass by it every day.
This is my first time here, seeing the statue. What do you think of it?
It draws mixed feelings every now and then. I come through and I see it. There's the emancipation, but I also think when I see the statue and the guy's on his knees, it's almost like he's begging to be freed.
What do you think of it?
Well, I think we're not sure if he's holding him down or if he's pulling him up.
I would view this statue as quite controversial. It's focusing on emancipation, but I don't think Lincoln freed the slaves for freedom's sake.
If you had been designing the statue, what would it have looked like?
I probably would have had the slaves standing probably equal with Lincoln, showing, hey, they're being freed and they're just as equal as he is.
Increasingly, African Americans want to claim a different history, not as the beneficiaries of Lincoln's benevolence, but as active participants in their very own emancipation. Today, that history is celebrated in black communities across the country.
We are celebrating the historic moment that people found out that they were free. This whole occasion just helps us to remember and respect ourselves even more. So, maybe, thank you, Abraham Lincoln, for that. But I think even more the abolitionists, and I think even more Frederick Douglass and people that galvanized the movement. One day he didn't wake up and just say, I'm gonna free the slaves. Things were in line to do that, there were things happening.
Exploring the story of emancipation, I felt torn by the opposite poles of the African American experience. I still treasured the Lincoln of my boyhood, the great emancipator who freed our people. But we have to confront history in all of its complexity. It's been deeply disappointing to me to learn that Lincoln came to emancipation slowly, that his motives were largely born out of military necessity, and that he questioned even the basic assumption of the equality of the races.
If you'd grown up as an African American, if there were two white men in your house, Abraham Lincoln was one of them.
You mean our picture on the wall?
Yeah, he had such a mythic presence. I mean, Lincoln still is a resonant spirit over the black community. But when I discovered that it wasn't only that Lincoln wanted to keep the Union together, but that he had deep doubts about the status of the Negro. And then when I discovered that he thought a gradual approach to the abolition of slavery would be better politically, but he thought it was 100 years for that gradual abolition.
Right.
That's not exactly good news for me.
But there are other things that you must have seen in the course of this journey. He was so far ahead of where anybody else would have been at that time, and he needs to win the war. So the only way to make this all possible was to move gradually until popular sentiment would sustain what he did.
You're absolutely right. I agree with that. If I'd been president, I think I would have followed the same blueprint.
Right.
That part of me says, Abe, you are the man. But part of me as an African American wants to believe that somebody actually meant that black people were included in all men are created equal.
Do you know what's so interesting, Skip, in listening to you talk? The problem is not your understanding of what was possible for Lincoln. The problem is the infatuation, the myth that Lincoln was presented in the first place to you. That's not Lincoln's fault. It's not Lincoln's fault that he got mythologized. He was a human being. He wouldn't have wanted to be mythologized. And I think to just bring him down now to the human being with his strengths and his weaknesses, if you could feel that as well as you're saying it, I think you would feel more empathy for him.
No, but you're right. It's clear that I don't feel it. I can think it, I can understand it.
Exactly, that's what I'm feeling.
But I am speaking as an African American whose hero has been knocked off the mantle.
I don't think I had fully realized the extent to, even in your childhood, that you would have had that mythic Lincoln still there. And what I hope you can do as somebody who is so thoughtful to be able to present both sides of Lincoln. The Lincoln who had to live in his time, who said disappointing things, but yet was an extraordinary figure.
Doris was right. The urge to judge Lincoln outside of his times is a strong one. It's worth remembering that his every decision was made in the context of the greatest crisis in our nation's history. Any misstep, and the country could fall apart. By the summer of 1863, 2.5 years into the war, over 250,000 Americans had already lost their lives, and there seemed to be no end in sight. We can see the toll it took on Lincoln. In 30 short months in office, he seemed to have aged a lifetime. At